Lucy, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am wrapping up what I read in both August and September, and I'm gonna film it in two parts because I'm not quite done with my September reading, but I'm gonna start by talking about what I read in August. Both were really great reading months, so let's start with August. I finished The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the third in the Probert trilogy, and I loved this series so much. I really liked the ending. I thought it was great. I loved pretty much everything about the series. It is this like dystopian fantasy series about this world that's like kind of falling apart, and you follow some interesting points of view, particularly this one woman who has this like earth rock powers kind of, but these people who have these kinds of powers are persecuted. So yeah, very interesting. Really enjoyed this. Next we have the second in the Lightfall graphic novels, and these are so cute and wholesome, and I love them. They're these like fantasy graphic novels about Bia and Cad and their journey to sort of save their world. Yes, definitely just as fantastic as the first one. Just really great. Love this series. So the more days at the Morisaki bookshop. This is about Takako, who finds out that her boyfriend is actually getting engaged, thus has this whole other life. And so her world kind of crumbles, and she decides to go live with, I think it's her uncle who runs this bookshop. And yeah, it's kind of the aftermath of that, and her like finding herself and finding her love of reading as well. So it's like really cool to read. I liked it almost better than I expected, but it wasn't like 5 stars. It's very like kind of mundane life. So there's not like a super interesting plot. But I really liked it. I thought it had great vibes and was very cute. Okay, so next was The God and the Gumiho, and this is a fantasy romance about this god, Soka, and he is this like trickster who has been banished by the gods for kind of trying to like defeat his brother. It's a long story that you kind of learn about, but he's essentially trying to get back into his brother's good graces / go back to like being a god. And in order to do that, he is essentially like helping solve crimes. There are like demons in the world that he can like go and help like solve crimes that they commit and get rid of them, basically. So that's what he's doing. And then Kim Hani is a Gumiho, and she is working at this like coffee shop that is mostly I think for magical beings, and they meet at the coffee shop in a pretty negative way, and so immediately there's like some hate vibes, and then they end up teaming up to find out like what is going on in the city. Essentially like people are being killed and they can't figure out what's happening and need to like catch the demon who is responsible. So I actually thought this was great. I thought it was like really like well balanced in terms of plot and romance, and it definitely wasn't like my favorite ever, but I feel like it was pretty up there. Just a great, interesting story, with a lot of interesting like folklore. Yeah, I really liked it. Next we had Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This has been on my bookshelf for a while, and I finally got around to reading it. I'm not really sure what inspired this, but it's like this horror book. It reminds me a little bit, actually 2 books in this video are gonna remind me of that, but it reminds me a little bit of Mexican Gothic, vaguely, but this is YA, and it is this like sapphic YA sort of romance, but also about these like friendships between these girls at this school, and they're on this like island school where students are being like infected by this like plague thing. They're being infected essentially, and so they're kind of like quarantined on this island and can't get off, and we don't know a lot about what's going on, but yeah, it's very like kind of creepy vibes. I thought it was fine. It was very like middle of the road for me, but it's not my like usual genre. I do think that if you like YA and the Mexican gothic-y vibes, like light horror, because it was like not that scary. It would just like, you didn't really know what was going on, and there was this like weird, there's some like weird body related things because of the like plague or whatever is infecting them. So yeah, they're trying to survive on this island, especially like shit kind of hits the fan and they have to figure out how to survive. Okay, next is Doppelgänger by Naomi Klein, and this is a nonfiction, and it is about the author. So she writes about her own life and politics, and she's been like a pretty strong voice in politics and social activism, and she's been often confused with Naomi Wolf, who they have this like weird connection early on, and then Naomi Wolf has gone away in like the conspiracy far right like side of things, and Naomi Klein like shares her experience of being like confused for this person and what that has done to like her own psyche, and kind of, yeah, she talks about all sorts of things through this, like politics, a little bit of, yeah, her own psychology and her experience. I have a couple of thoughts on it. I overall think it was good, and I had a really good time reading it. Really interesting. But I will say, especially in the beginning, I feel like it was a little bit confusing and felt kind of all over the place. Like I feel like I wasn't like following one like train for a while. And it wasn't till the last like third where I thought it was like really interesting and hit on some really important topics. It talked a lot about the conflict in Gaza, and this was like pre-2023. I think it might have come out in 2023. Yeah, this came out in September of 2023, and just did a really good job of talking about some issues. But yeah, I definitely like had my sort of problems with it, and I would say that first third was a little bit tougher for me to get through. But it was interesting, an interesting concept. Like she talks about this like doppelganger concept and kind of what that looks like in society. So yeah, Doppelgänger. I haven't talked about Supernova Era. This is by the same author as The Three Body Problem, which I have not got to yet, but for some reason just decided to pick this up, and it's kind of wild. It's essentially what happens in the beginning of this book is a supernova event occurs. Star that's like really far, eight light years away, a star dies and it causes a supernova that impacts Earth. And the way it impacts Earth is it essentially kills off everybody over the age of 13. And the point of that is then the whole kind of point of the story is very like Lord of the Flies, and trying to get like and to understand like what would happen essentially if you like left all these like young kids in charge of everything. And I thought it was really interesting. I feel like I looked up some reviews and they were pretty negative, and I actually thought this was like a really interesting case study. It's like totally out there and wild, and a lot of really wild stuff happens. But in the beginning, these kids are being trained by like parents and other people to work jobs, and then as soon as the event hits, because they essentially know in advance like a little bit, they realize this is coming and what is going to happen, so they're able to train them, and then it's like up to these kids to keep their countries going. So there's some like immediate like what happens following this, and then there's also a lot of like international politics that was just fascinating. It is definitely crazy and kind of disgusting at a lot of different points, but I thought it was really interesting. And it's funny because I don't even really like Lord of the Flies, but I thought this was like a very interesting take on that. It did make me question if I should go back and reread Lord of the Flies, because who knows, maybe I'll have a, more of an appreciation for it now. Couple more. We have a reread, Anne of Green Gables. So I've been wanting to read this for a while, and it just felt like a perfect summer, early August like read. Just like very nostalgic and great story. It's a classic one if you're not familiar. Essentially, Anne is an orphan who is put with Marilla and Matthew. And Marilla and Matthew have like requested an orphan child, their brother and sister, and they're older, and so they need some help around their farm. They request a boy, and they get Anne from like some mistake, and it's just like Anne's adventure on this island and her life there, and her relationships that develop with Marilla and Matthew and other people on the island. It's just very like wholesome and sweet, and Anne is just a charismatic, fun character to read. The things that I like had forgotten reading this, one, it was definitely more religious than I expected. I'm like not religious at all, and that was just like interesting. I didn't remember that at all, and so that was, I don't know, just something I noticed. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting is this book spans, like by the end of this book, I think she's 16. If she's not 16, she's like very close to 16. So she grows up in this whole book, and for some reason like all my memories of it are like when she was really young, and it does focus a lot on that, her like growing up, going to school, and like those experiences, but I just like didn't remember that. So by the end of this, she's like kind of grown up, and I just like didn't realize that much time passed in this first one. But I had a great time rereading it, and hopefully at some point we'll reread some of the others as well. And yeah, it's just very wholesome and sweet. Then we had Sleep Like Death, and this one was an unexpected read. It was from Fairy Loot, and I think it's so beautiful. This was like their YA pick for maybe July or August. July. It's a Snow White retelling, which I'm not sure I've ever really like read. I haven't read retellings in a little while, but I do enjoy them, and I enjoyed this a lot more than I expected to be honest. So essentially there is this knight, and this knight terrorizes this land, and the queen has been like trying to combat this and has basically raised her daughter to believe that she is like meant to destroy this knight. And so like that is like her purpose. So the knight essentially like grants people wishes, but they're always like sinister. There's always some sinister element to them. And as she's reaching her birthday, her mom begins to like, the queen begins to act like really strange, and she's not sure what's going on and won't really tell her anything. Princess Eve, she finds in her mom's room this like weird mirror, and inside the mirror there is this like person. And so it begins this whole adventure. Her mom is clearly keeping secrets. She doesn't really know what's going on, and she also needs to defeat this king. I really liked it. I thought it was great. It did a really good job of towing that line between like having its own story and keeping true to like the original Snow White. Like you could very much tell where everything came from, but it also had elements of it that I thought were really different and interesting. And so yeah, I really enjoyed it. I also was impressed because like I've been not really loving YA lately, and I actually like this more than I thought I would. I think I gave it maybe like 3.5 stars, which is good for YA for me right now. I think it's just because I have really not been in that mindset, and this definitely like has a lot of like YA characteristics, and the main character definitely has that like arrogant, very arrogant vibe and mentality where she thinks she can do more than she can, which is just like classic. But I think it worked a little bit better in this, and I feel like she grew a lot and started to understand things, and I enjoyed it. So honestly, as far as Snow White retellings go, I definitely recommend this one. I think this one was good. So, and then last, I almost said certainly not least, but in reality, I think it might be least of all the books I read. Yeah. So I read When the Moon Hatched, and this has like gone super viral in the romantasy world. Everyone is like likening it to ACOTAR and Fourth Wing, and I actually found out about this because my friend read it maybe midsummer or something like that, and it was like texted like our friend group and wanted everybody to read it and like loved it so much. So we all started reading it, and I don't know, I had a really hard time with this one. I have a lot of thoughts on it. I will just give a very brief synopsis. Ooh, don't remember her name. I really don't. Rave. So Rave is an assassin, and she is caught. Yeah, so So like all happens in kind of the beginning here. But she's an assassin, she gets caught, and she's going to be put to death, and what's his name? This guy comes in and saves her, and they've like met before. Sounds familiar, right? Kind of. I'm not even gonna say more about the plot because like, just to me, there was no plot for like so much of this book. The plot was the romance. Like it felt like everything that happened was like for the romance. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Like in general, I think like romance is great. I love a good romance. Like there's so many great things about romance. However, the issue with this, and this like might be spoilery, so I just want to like give warning, and I'll like put where I end up like finishing talking about this, but I feel like I can't give a review without saying this. Like you don't actually see their love develop. I'm trying to be pretty vague about this so it's not too spoilery, but like if it was about the romance, then I want to see how their love like develops for the first time. That's the spoilery part. And you don't. So like I feel like if anything, this like should have been the second book. It just was not working for me at all in that regard. Like the balance between romance and plot wasn't super working. So now I'll talk like slightly less spoilery things. This book is like, it to me was a complete rip off of Throne of Glass in so many ways. And I just like had a hard time not seeing different Sarah J. Maas books in this. Usually I totally get that like tropes and things and like themes are totally reused in romantasy in all books, right? And like that, like things are reused. But for some reason in this one, it felt just like way too similar to Throne of Glass. I even saw some ACOTAR in there. There's even a few like Crescent City. Like I just felt exactly that. And then you threw the dragons in, like it felt like Fourth Wing. And the problem to me was like the parts that like could have made it unique didn't feel like they were focused on that much, which is also why I felt like this could have been the second book and I might have had a better time with it. So there's like dragons and there's some like cool lore with the dragons is what it seems like, but we don't get very much of that. It definitely doesn't feel like the main focus. There's also some really interesting magic that I think could have been the main focus, and we're just like, that didn't feel like it. So I struggled. I struggled with this in many ways. Yeah, and to be fair, it's like I didn't love Celaena in Throne of Glass, so, and I felt like this character was Celaena exactly, including like a lot of the negative things, and so I'm not entirely surprised that I didn't like it very much, because I didn't like Celaena and they were very similar, and so I just like don't like some of those like traits in general, just like the super self-centered and arrogant throughout. And it's like with this, we also didn't even like have much of backstory to go off as to like why she was this way. Yeah, there were also lots of like plot points that I like felt like came out of absolutely nowhere and felt so unnecessary. Like the only thing they felt necessary for was like the romance, but because the reader is so out of the loop on the romance, it just like did not hit at all on that side of things. Anyway, I was really disappointed because like I wanted to like it. I have had, despite like, they're not my favorite books of all time, but I've had such like a great time reading some romantasy, like Fourth Wing and other things. Like I've had a good time reading them, and this one was a slog. Like I had to push through it because my friends were reading it and I felt so bad like going to them and being like, it was not the vibe for me. And if our friends like read the second one, I probably will, because I will say the end, you start to learn more and like you start to see where the plot is going, which I get in the fantasy series that happens, like you're setting up, especially in the first book. But this felt like this is 700 pages or more, 700 pages, and you don't know, like there's really no plot until the end. So, okay, I'm gonna stop ranting. Yeah, so a little bit disappointing, just a little bit. But we did have some good reads in the month of August. So yeah, I'm gonna pause here and I will come back and film September's, and I'll have kind of this whole wrap up be both August and September. So we are back with September reads. very excited about these. It was a great reading month. And we actually kicked it off with a really fun reread of The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. It's been a couple of years since I've read this. My partner had never read it before, and we were going to T.J. Klune's like book event in Salt Lake City. So we like listened to it on a road trip that we were on at the beginning of the month, and it was just so great. It's still as like wholesome and as wonderful as I remember it being. Just love all the characters. It's essentially about this man, Linus, who works for the department in charge of magical youth. And he's like an auditor. Shoot, I don't know what they call him. Oh, a caseworker. He's a caseworker for them. So he goes to these like orphanages with magical youth and like determines if everything is okay, basically. So he ends up getting assigned to this one school, place where he goes that's on this island, this very like quaint, cute island. But everything is definitely not as it seems, kind of like it's a harder case. He was sent there for a reason. There's a lot of interesting things about the children and the person running it, Arthur. It's just so wholesome and adorable, and the characters are incredible. All the kids there are so cute and just wonderful, and it's just so great. I highly recommend it, especially if you need something comforting, a nice warm cup of tea. That would be The House in the Cerulean Sea. And the reason the book event was in September was because Somewhere Beyond the Sea just came out, and I actually have not read it yet, so it's not included in the wrap up, but that's kind of why we were reading it, and I'm very excited to read the next one because he's mostly done standalones recently, but this just had like such high praise. People loved it so much, and he did kind of like leave it open to a sequel. Like it's not like not wrapped up, like it's not a book that you wouldn't be satisfied just reading the first, but it definitely leaves room for more things to be explored, and I'm so excited to read this. I had such a great time at this event. It was so great. It was just wonderful. It was in Salt Lake. T.J. Klune was great. Had a lot of really great things to say about writing and politics and stuff like that, and I was just, yes, loved it. So that was the first read. Started off on a good note. Next, we had The Anthropocene Reviewed, which was on my TBR for the month, and really loved it. Expected to, though. It has very like podcasty vibes because I think it did start as a podcast, so like each chapter is kind of an essay on a specific topic, and at the end John Green rates it out of 5 stars. It covers so many different things. I'm gonna like open to a random one. Teddy bears, I remember sunsets, geese, like all sorts of things, Auld Lang Syne, like so many things. It was also kind of fun because I had already read maybe like half of it and I just like hadn't continued, so this was kind of partially a reread. But I also listened to the audiobook for some of them, and I found that in more recent editions he'd like added more to it. And I think I put a note, shoot, I don't know where I put that note. Oh yeah, I put a little note about all the stories that he added in because I thought that was so fun because they're not in my copy. So an example, the smallpox vaccine, ginkgo tree, the orbital sunrise. So that was like really fun, and yeah, I highly recommend, especially if you like a little bit more of a casual vibe. The audiobook with John Green reading it was great, and it is definitely more like just like podcasty vibes, kind of exploring a little bit of each topic. It was so fun because I feel like it got me thinking about what I would want to write these sort of essays on. Like I feel like I could translate to myself and be like, oh my gosh, I feel like this would be a really cool way to like write, not a biography, but yeah, like kind of talk about you and your life, but like through other things. Anyway, it was just like a fun thing to think about, and like, ooh, like what essays and what topics would I be really interested in, want to talk about and rate out of 5 stars. So, which is funny because I feel like I complain about the 5-star rating system in books, but it was still fun and it was a great concept. Okay, next is one of my favorite books. Like I am sure it's gonna make my top books of the year. That was Chain Gang All-Stars. I'd ended up hearing some mixed things about this book, but kind of knew it would be up my alley because it's like a dystopian novel that's like about the prison system and kind of violence and how people like choose to love, how we choose to punish, and what that punishment means for society and in different contexts based off of what people do. So such a fascinating read. Essentially, it follows Thurwar, Stax, and these other group of prisoners who are in this prison system in the future, in which they're on this like TV show where they're fighting to the death. So it's like very complex, and this is just like one part of the prison system, but they're like in this, like, it's called the CAPE program, and they battle their way to freedom. So they've all committed crimes, like they're in prison, although that's definitely explored also, who is in prison, why they were there, and kind of like the different circumstances. They get the opportunities to essentially like battle their way to freedom. And it takes a long time. You essentially, like, you have to beat everyone, go through this whole program, and it's like really hard and rare, and only like one person has ever done it. But that's the concept behind it, and it's all televised, and it's like this huge phenomenon that everyone is like obsessed with, like the general public. They all watch it. They have the people they cheer for. And there's actually a second show that, like, one shows like the battles that they have, and then the other is like their daily lives. And it's so fascinating to read. You get a couple of different points of view, and there is a couple that are from like people who are actually viewing it and watching it, so you get some of like the mindset of like this dystopian future, and like why people are watching it, and like what they're feeling and thinking and all this stuff. So I just thought that it was such a fascinating look at humanity, especially the darker sides of humanity. So like many of the characters are like have committed these like really horrendous crimes, but are also treated in like completely despicable, inhumane ways. And it's just such an interesting thing to like grapple with and think about humanity. So I can see how people also would struggle with this, and it's like very dark and kind of gruesome and like hard to like think about and digest. But I just thought it was like such an interesting look at humanity, the prison system, racism, and also just generally like how we treat each other and view each other. So yes, highly recommend. Oh, and I guess I'll say one more thing on this book. I was thinking about how to rate this, because it is sometimes written in a semi-confusing way, in that you don't know who's always like speaking when you're in a different POV. Like you don't know whose head you're in, whose narrative you're reading from. But as I continue to think about how to rate this, like despite that, I almost think that that way of writing like added to it, and it added this like certain element, and it just was like impossible not to give 5 stars. Like I just couldn't find anything that like I truly didn't like about it. Yeah, I like got why the author made that decision. It was just, I was only grappling with because I like, sometimes it was confusing and I didn't totally get that. But that's another reason I can see why some people might not love this book, but I did. I thought it was great. Definitely highly recommend. Next, I'll talk about some books that were on my TBR as well. There was The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands by Sarah Brooks, and beautiful book. I just like love these pages of the train and just like that. I don't know, I love this. And I was really intrigued by the concept of this book. Essentially, there's these wastelands. So it's kind of historical, like fantasy, I guess. 1899, like end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Essentially, there's this train that travels to and from Beijing and Moscow, and it travels across the wastelands. And it's this really big deal because like you travel on this train, but you're not supposed to get out. Like the wastelands are this like thing that people talk about and that is like heard about, but you don't really, like clearly like something is up in the wastelands, but we don't really know as a reader kind of like what it is. But some of the people on the train are like studying the wastelands and trying to figure out what's out there. But it's very blocked off from the rest of society. Like on either ends of the train, there's like this whole like wall and like gate situation essentially. So yeah, it's this great Trans-Siberian Express, and this book takes place on one of the trips across the wastelands, and it's a really special one because the last time there had been some sort of breach to the train, and it's been a really long time since they've done like a trip across the wastelands. And so you're following these different people who are on board the train. Yeah, I found it to be really fascinating. It was definitely not entirely what I would expect, or what I did expect from this. I thought it was going to be a lot more like mystery heavy and less kind of like strange fantasy. So yeah, I hope I'm not giving anything away too much, but I just like really thought it was going to be a little more focused on like some kind of mystery. And there is a lot of mystery also, but it's just not totally what I expected. Kind of similar to like Mexican Gothic with like not quite as dark vibes though. And definitely a very interesting cast of characters, and I liked the train vibes. I thought that was fun. So yeah. So next is the Underground Railroad, and this is Colson Whitehead. I've had this on my reading list for a really long time, and I read this for my TBR. For my prompt was like, read a book that has won a prize, a book prize. And this is about Cora, and she's a slave on a cotton plantation in Georgia, and she is essentially, this book is like her journey to escape slavery. And there are definitely parts of it that are really dark, but I think it's really well done, and it has a level of like kind of magical realism in that the whole thing here is like the Underground Railroad in this book is like a physical railroad, and that is kind of like sprinkled in throughout the book. So yeah, it deals with a lot of like tough issues and a lot about family and a lot about like Cora trying to find her place and also trying to escape this like really terrible place. So yeah, the Underground Railroad. I've had such a mixed relationship with romance in the past, or I don't know, I guess a couple of years. And I read One Star Romance by Laura Hankin. So this follows Natalie and Rob, and Natalie is like a writer-y, artist-y person, and she writes this book, and Rob like gives it a 1 star. And so they know each other because their best friends are getting married, and Rob is best man and Natalie is the maid of honor. So they end up like on vacations together because of these best friends and like seeing each other throughout the course of this book. But they have this like animosity also going on, especially because of this like 1 star review that he leaves on her book. And so that kind of begins their tension, and kind of we follow them throughout actually a pretty long period of time. And I think that's why this book worked more for me than other romances I've read in recent years, because I think there was like enough time in those years to like really grow as characters and as people and like in this relationship and see things develop. And I think I struggle with that often in romances. And in this, you definitely had characters that were really selfish and like not great, like not very likable. But because it took place over such a long period of time, you really got to see so much growth and like change happening in their lives. And I thought that was like much more relatable and interesting to read about. So I thought that was like really fun and different in my opinion. So I actually enjoyed this romance and definitely would recommend it. I thought it was like just written a little bit differently and still had a lot of great like tension vibes and stuff like that. So yeah, I like highly enjoyed both of their character arcs, and you just like see them growing up and like them changing as adults. And I feel like you don't see that as much. Like you may see that throughout YA and stuff like that, but I feel like you really saw them grow and like go through really huge struggles with their careers, and also just like how that changed them and helped them grow as people. So I really enjoyed that side of it. I definitely don't think it was like 5-star territory for me, but overall really enjoyed, and definitely in like the top romances I've read this year. So that was definitely a fun time. Let's talk about The Hero of Ages next, by Brandon Sanderson. This is the third in the Mistborn trilogy, like the first 3, and I read the last 2 kind of towards the end of last year, so it's taking me a little bit to get to this one, but just for a variety of reasons. But I had a really great time reading it. It just reminded me of how great Brandon Sanderson is at doing fantasy and like world building and characters, and just like so well thought out. I really enjoyed this so much. I love that his books like still have stakes. They have some romance. They just like have everything. And I can't believe it took me so many years to really start reading Brandon Sanderson, but I had such a great time with the third one. I won't say too much more because it's the third, but the series just like highly recommend, especially if you've not read Brandon Sanderson. It's a great way to get into it. Mistborn essentially follows these characters. It's difficult. It's like very high fantasy on this planet in this world where there's like this metal magic where like some people can like do this like magic through different metals, and the world itself is like very complex, and there's like these very much oppressed peoples, but there's a lot of like mystery and not total not understanding of like what's going on in the world and with the Lord Ruler. So yes, just highly recommend this series. Next, we had Merlin's Harp by Eliot Crompton. And this was also for my TBR video. I've started pulling a book from like my really old TBR, like physical TBR jar thing. So this is like one of the oldest books on my TBR. I think it was from either my mom or my grandmother, and I've literally had it for probably like 10 or 15 years. So finally read it. So I'm proud of myself for that, like for making headway on that situation. That feels good. This is a sort of, it's not a King Arthur retelling, but it is in like the King Arthur realm of things. It's not a retelling because it's not really about King Arthur per se. He's in it, but it is about Nivian, who is the daughter of the lady of the lake. Merlin is in it, all like the characters from in King Arthur, but you mostly follow Nivian, who is a fae. And you actually, despite being a really short book, it spans pretty much the course of her whole life and her growing up as a fae on this island and seeing people and her kind of relationship to humans as fae, and then her involvement in King Arthur's story and kind of what happens after that. And I actually thought, like, I wasn't sure I was gonna like this. I just wasn't, I don't know, I had no idea. I think I rated it, ended up rating it 3.5. And I would say that's pretty accurate. Like, it definitely wasn't the best in that, like, the plot was not super straightforward or clear for me, and that was a little bit hard, but I don't think it was bad. Like, I think it was actually a really interesting story of Nivian, following her life. I also thought it was a refreshing take on fae. I say refreshing like that because it's like from the 90s, which was also fun to read because this was like, feels more like the OG fae, like the original, like that is what fae have been in the past, and fairies, and kind of like the more mischievous, less romanticized. There's still some of that in here, but I think that it showed that side a little bit more, like almost a little more like Emily Wilde. I don't know why I also kept picturing some of the hobbits from The Rings of Power, which I just thought was really funny. They're not hobbits, but it's just, I don't know, the vibes were kind of like that a little bit, like Rings of Power-y. So yeah, that was Merlin's Harp. Kind of a strange read for me, but definitely interesting. We also had, actually before I talk about the last two, I will mention that I like soft DNF this. I don't usually talk about DNFs because more often than not, I like come back to books. This was on my actual TBR for the month, and I read, I think I took the bookmark out because I'm probably gonna have to start over. I feel like maybe I read like 150 pages of this, and I just was not in the right headspace. And so that's kind of the only reason I did want to talk about it, because I feel like it's worth talking about that just concept of not being in the right place for certain books. And I feel like with Murakami, like I've always really loved his writing, but definitely struggled with characters and the way he writes about certain things sometimes. So I feel like that also probably impacts like my ability to be in like the right headspace for it. Because this time around, like it was kind of strange. It was like the first time with his work that I wasn't even really fully appreciating the writing style, I think. And so I just was like, you know what, I need to like take a break, come back to this later. But like I'm soft DNFing it, and then I'll come back to it. I just don't think it'll be for a long time. So that's why I'm also choosing to talk about it. So yeah, putting that one down for now. And then we had a relatively strong finish. We had The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Took me a long time to get into this, or to finally read this, but I finally did, and I'm very excited about it. If you're not familiar with the story, it follows, I'm trying to remember, I can't hear the main, Basil. Yes. This painter, Basil, paints this portrait of Dorian Gray, and they also have this friend, Lord Henry, who is not the greatest influence, has some kind of sus views on women, relationships, everything. Yeah, just life. And he very much influences Dorian Gray and how he should like treat people, and essentially like the course of his life. So yeah, the essentially this picture takes on like all of Dorian's sins. He's not exactly a great person. So yeah, it follows his life and kind of this painting and these relationships between Basil, Lord Henry and Dorian Gray, and it's just a very interesting take on a lot of things, including like vanity and being human and living life. And yeah, I really like this, and I definitely want to put it into my rotation of maybe every other year, trying to come back to this in the fall. It felt very fall vibes. So yeah, The Picture of Dorian Gray. The last book I read, I really hope I'm not forgetting anything here. The last book I read is Long Live Evil. And this was a fairy loot book. Actually, I think it was last month or August maybe, actually. Really cool. Cool sprayed edges. Yeah, so cute. And that too. Anyway, this book is about Ray, and she is living in the normal world, and she has cancer, and she's talking to her sister, and they're talking about these like books, this book series that they absolutely love, this fantasy book series, like romantasy. And what ends up happening just really early on is Ray, someone comes into the room and like offers for Ray to like go into the story and try to like save herself. Like if she finds this flower of death, I think it's called Life and Death or something, then she can save her life in the real world. The kind of catch though is that she goes into this book into like the body of one of the villains that is about to be executed. And in the series that like she's read is executed at that time. So Ray has to like save herself, but like as this villain, and everyone doesn't like her and like thinks she's a really terrible person. So she's like has to use that and like go from what she is given. So that's kind of the gist of the story. I thought it was very fun in that it's very like camp, very meta, like just very fun as a reader to read this. I definitely probably wouldn't pick this up if you're like not in the fantasy genre at all, because I feel like it could be really confusing because you don't know the actual, like there are a few things you know and that Ray tells you as the reader about the series, but we don't actually know the full plot or like what is happening. And that was just one thing that I even found pretty confusing sometimes. It's like really hard to follow what is happening and how it's changing the story, and we're kind of told that, but we're like almost a little too in the dark about some things that it just was a little bit confusing. But I think overall I had a fun time reading it. I wouldn't say it was like the best book I've read, but I had a really fun time just because conceptually it was such a funny and interesting premise, and it was really fun to learn about like how the plot was changing and other characters and like how they like related and how Ray saw the characters in the book because they were in a book. So there were some really interesting aspects to this, and overall I would say I had a fun time reading it, but I wouldn't say it was like the most well written or well thought out book, I think. Yeah. But also I will say, and I've noticed this a lot, I've ended up in the past, like into October too, reading the first in a book series. And I just had to remind myself again that this is the first in a series, and you kind of have to check yourself and be like, this is like, you know, you don't know a lot and this is set up, and it definitely felt like setup. So I think it's like worth knowing going into this. It's like I had no idea this was going to be a series, so I kind of expected it to be a standalone. And I think if that's your expectation, it's definitely doesn't. Yeah, I feel like it doesn't quite live up to that. But knowing that it's a series would definitely have helped me be a little bit more open-minded on that side. But again, just like fun read. So yeah. All right, well, that was the month of September. I am also having a great reading month in October. It's just been like really chaotic. I have tons of work stuff going on, so it's been really hard to like film and do any sort of YouTube stuff, but still going along when I can and reading as much as I can, and I hope you are too. Would love to know if you have any great recommendations as of late. And with that, I will see you in the next video.